This past February, Nintendo ended off their direct presentation with an announcement trailer for a brand new Splatoon game, Splatoon 3. Since then, the community has been going crazy with predictions and speculation as we await more information. Some fans are even trying to make Splatoon 3 before Nintendo does. The truth is, we really don't have that much information about the game yet. All we have is a glimpse of the game's setting and a little bit of multiplayer gameplay. But what I want to talk about today is this shot right here. We see what appears to be the beginning of the game, or possibly the game's single-player campaign. I've watched a ton of reactions to this trailer, and something that seems to have crossed everyone's mind upon seeing this camera pan was, yo, open world Splatoon? And I find this funny, because when I saw this shot, I actually had pretty much the opposite reaction and was scared this was going to be some kind of 2.5D side-scroller. Of course, we know it's not going to be 2D, but this got me thinking about just what kind of structure the Splatoon 3 single player might have. I've never really made a video like this before, but I thought it would be fun to get on the speculation hype train and discuss what we might see in the next game. Let's get talking. Now, back to that open-world Splatoon thing. When playing linear games, lots of people wonder what the game would be like if it was more open-ended. This isn't always the direction a game series should go, but it's certainly been done before, and with huge success. The questions we're facing are, could Splatoon work as an open-world game? And would it even be possible to make? When people say open world, that can mean a lot of things. To start off, let's talk about the least likely format Splatoon's single player could take. A true open world game, where the player is given tools to explore a massive overworld at their own pace. Open world games normally have a few shared traits that make them fun to play. The core gameplay and movement around the game world is fun and satisfying, the world is filled with varied content and objectives, and the player character progresses in power through stat buffs or skill upgrades. To address this first point, Splatoon relies upon its shooting and swimming mechanics for a large portion of its campaigns. I don't think it would be too difficult to keep this entertaining in a larger environment as long as terrain is interesting and fun to traverse. However, there would likely have to be some form of transportation to move around more quickly. Filling the world with diverse content, on the other hand, would be a much greater challenge. Splatoon's mechanics rely heavily on combat and platforming. You can't just slap a bunch of enemies onto a world map and call it a game, and it would be pretty unrealistic to expect polished platforming gameplay in every corner of a vast overworld. It's easy to look at any game and imagine how it would play if it were designed like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. However, not every game can simply be inserted into this formula. The core gameplay of Breath of the Wild is the exploration. Link's movement and all of his abilities are built around the way the player interacts with the world of Hyrule. Splatoon 3, on the other hand, is a direct sequel. The core gameplay of shoot and swim is already established, and it simply isn't built for covering huge distances while completing large tasks. It's built for fast-paced platforming and short combat encounters. Lastly, player progression is something we actually have seen in both Splatoon 1 and 2 in the form of power egg upgrades for weapons, subs, and the character's ink tank. However, these upgrades are fairly insignificant when it comes to altering the core gameplay and would not feel very impactful in a game with a larger scope. And to address the elephant in the room, making a truly open-world Splatoon game within this time frame is simply not feasible. It would be asking way too much of a development team to create a massive, explorable world alongside a well-balanced multiplayer shooter, especially considering that when Splatoon 3 comes out, it will only have been 4 years since Octo Expansion was released. As cool as open-world Splatoon sounds on paper, I really don't see the series ever going in that direction. If it does, it would have to be a standalone experience from the multiplayer, which would likely alienate a lot of fans of the series. Let's take a look at the other extreme. Splatoon 3 seems to be taking many aspects of the series in a new direction, but maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's entirely possible that Nintendo will play it safe and create another level-based campaign with a focus on short combat and platforming sections. Octo Valley and Octo Canyon are very well designed, and while the formula kinda started to get old by the end of Splatoon 2's campaign, I wouldn't call any of these levels particularly bad or lazy. In fact, many of them are pretty amazing. They follow Nintendo's tried and true formula of introducing an idea to the player and then using it again and again in interesting ways in tandem with other mechanics. This is the perfect design for a linear game. Segmented gameplay sections, a very clear focus with straightforward solutions to overcome obstacles, but also a need to introduce new mechanics to keep gameplay interesting and engaging. Splatoon 1's Octo Valley had the player use a shooter weapon to run through fast-paced linear levels. These levels challenge the player with a wide variety of enemies and platforming mechanics. Almost every level introduces a new mechanic or remixes an old one in new and interesting ways. The final boss of Splatoon 1 is one of the greatest in the series, and was a great end to a unique and well-crafted story mode. Splatoon 2's Octo Canyon follows a very similar structure in both gameplay and story. The player reveals levels in the hub, collects a Zapfish at the end of each level, unlocks the boss, and continues to the next area. New mechanics are introduced, and many return from the previous game. One of the biggest changes in Splatoon 2 is that the player unlocks 9 different weapon types across the campaign. This adds some much needed variety to the levels and helps to keep things interesting. However, this may have actually been a detriment to the level design, as the developers had to make sure that every level could be completed with any of the 9 weapons. This caused them to play it a bit safe when designing challenges, resulting in a lot of levels feeling kinda similar. This problem was largely solved in Splatoon 2's Octo expansion, where each test chamber comes with a specific set of weapons that can be used. This still allows for some player choice without sacrificing the design of the challenges, since Agent 8 isn't restricted to only 9 hero weapons, but instead granted various weapons from multiplayer. There's even more variety in gameplay. While Octo Valley and Octo Canyon required the player to get from point A to point B in every single level, Octo Expansion instead uses unique clear conditions for each test chamber. This change allowed the developers to go crazy with tons of different ideas, and it was a really refreshing take on the Splatoon formula. Octo Expansion is arguably the best Splatoon single-player experience so far. However, it's held back by its reuse of content, such as the Octo Canyon boss fights, and lack of a real hub area. It's easy to get excited for Splatoon 3's single-player because it doesn't have the restrictions that come with being a DLC expansion. Octo Expansion raised the bar for Splatoon single-player. The standard is now much greater. The community is expecting Nintendo to remix the formula again and deliver an experience at least as good as what we got in Splatoon 2's DLC. Can Nintendo really do that with another linear campaign? Well, maybe. Mario's reinvented the wheel time and time again, and that seems to be going fine. But it's possible that this formula is limiting where the developers can take the series. Mario can get away with using a similar structure in every game because they all feel different to play. Mario's physics are adjusted and refined, and new abilities are added to Mario's core moveset. The thing is, Splatoon is primarily a multiplayer shooter. The core gameplay should be retained as much as possible. New playstyles and mechanics should simply be additional features. This limitation means the developers can't create a whole new movement system or game feel, thus the linear format becomes much more restricting to the game's single player. So, an open world game is too large in scope and unfit for Splatoon's gameplay, but a linear game restricts the potential of Splatoon's movement and mechanics. If only there was some kind of game that incorporated open-ended traversal and experimentation with tight movement and platforming. Oh wait. There is. Now, hear me out. Imagine this. A Splatoon game built around large, sandbox-style environments rather than linear levels. Think Mario 64, Mario Odyssey, Bowser's Fury. These kinds of games typically have large levels that allow for player choice and experimentation, consistent options for movement and combat throughout most of the playthrough, and varied objectives that have to be discovered and obtained. I can honestly imagine Splatoon shoot and swim gameplay working very well in this type of setting. We've already gotten a glimpse of what this could look like in the hub worlds of Octo Valley and Canyon. In Splatoon 1 and 2, the hubs are used to break up the pacing of the quick-moving platforming gameplay. In this hypothetical campaign, it would be the other way around. Levels would be large and expansive, allowing players to explore at their own pace. Each area would be scattered with smaller, shorter objectives, just like the ones seen in many Octo Expansion test chambers. These could range from combat challenges to balloon popping to escorting an 8-ball, or anything like that. In addition, there would be more traditional Splatoon platforming sections incorporated into the level itself. Normally, Splatoon levels don't have very organic design, but they could definitely make stage elements like gushers or ink rails fit well into a themed setting. The Splatoon series has always come with a surprising amount of lore, and I think it would be much more fitting to see fully realized environments in the Splatoon world to give some context for all of the more obscure story details. Imagine actually getting to explore one of the towns we see in the Octarian Domes, or getting to climb up Mount Nantai, or exploring the outskirts of Octo Valley. Now, remember, this would not be a fully open-world game. Levels would be restricted in size, and exploration would only go so far. However, compared to the floating platform gameplay we're used to, it would mean much more freedom and immersion than ever before. Maybe the player could even swap between different weapons on the fly, like in Octo Canyon. This would encourage experimentation with different weapon types and help players to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each weapon. Some sections of gameplay would be designed around a specific weapon, keeping the player engaged by presenting new ways to play the game. Splatoon will likely always be a multiplayer-first game, and because of that, its single-player will always be somewhat restricted. However, I believe that this walled garden structure would provide an exciting new experience while still retaining the core gameplay we've come to know and love. The world of Splatoon would feel more alive than ever, and the story and lore would benefit greatly from these physical in-game spaces. This would certainly be a new frontier for the series, but I think it has the potential to turn the Splatoon single-player experience on its head and open up new opportunities for gameplay and story alike. To wrap things up, an open-world Splatoon adventure would be ambitious and exciting, but is not really realistic within the restrictions of time and scope, and probably wouldn't fit Splatoon's gameplay too well. A fully linear Splatoon game would likely be fun and well designed, but would be a bit of a disappointment without some major changes to distinguish it from the past two games. So a walled garden, sandbox style Splatoon game, in my opinion, has the potential to shake up the formula in a way no one would see coming. I think it's completely feasible that the developers could create a decent length campaign in this format, and it's something that I would personally love to see. The world of Splatoon is fascinating, and I would love to see more fully realized areas outside of Inkopolis or Splatsville. There's so much potential for new and exciting gameplay, characters, story, and lore in Splatoon 3, and I can't wait to see where they take all this in the next game. If you watched this far, feel free to tell me what you think we might see in the next game in the comments. The Splatoon community is super creative, and I think it's really fun to throw around ideas, even if they might never happen. At the time of this video, E3 2021 is just around the corner, and while I'm hopeful for some Splat 3 news, I don't imagine we'll know much about the single player for a while. We still have a lot of time before Splatoon 3 launches, but I'm sure it will be worth the wait. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.